Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to People's Question Time online. If you wish to tweet about the event tonight, the hashtag is #PQT. We have 5 core topic areas and will spend up to 20 minutes on each. Other questions related to the Mayor and Assembly's remit outside of these core topics can be asked in the final section. This is how it works. For each topic, the Chair will take about 6 questions. 3 of these will be video questions taken from the Talk London PQT discussion forum. 3 other questions, or more if we have time, will be taken from the most liked questions posted by registered audience members on the live chat this evening. The Chair will direct these to the Mayor or an Assembly member. To make sure we get through as many questions as possible and cover a range of issues, duplicated questions will not be asked. Please keep your questions short and on topic and refrain from abusive or defamatory remarks. These will not be posted. With so many of you online, we will not be able to ask everyone's question. After the event, registered audience members will receive a feedback form with details of how to submit questions to the Mayor and London Assembly. We will finish tonight at 9 p.m. sharp. This event is being broadcast live and recorded. For those with hearing impairments, there will be live subtitles throughout the event, as well as a British Sign Language interpreter joining us for the whole evening, who should be visible to you in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. For anyone wishing to have a transcript of the event, this will be available on request after the event. And now, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I'd like to introduce your chair this evening, the Assembly Member for Brent and Harrow and Chair of the London Assembly, Navin Shah.
Good evening and welcome to People's Question Time online. The Mayor and the London Assembly work to improve life for Londoners and make our city a great place to live and work. And that's why we want to hear from you about things that need to be improved in London. The London Assembly holds the Mayor to account to ensure that all his policies, strategies, and actions are in the best interest of Londoners. We're always here to make sure the Mayor is doing what's right for Londoners and our city. People's Question Time is your chance to voice your concerns and ask the Mayor and Assembly members what we are doing for the capital and its people. I have a brief announcement before I introduce the London Assembly and the Mayor, and then we can take your questions. Normally, we would be delivering this event for you from a venue in one of our London boroughs. However, due to COVID-19, tonight is slightly different. Tonight, I'm here at City Hall, whilst the rest of the Assembly, the Mayor and you, the audience, are joining us virtually. We will still hear questions from Londoners live and of course online. We'll be taking some questions direct from the live chat, some from Londoners randomly selected to join us live on Zoom, and some questions pre-recorded via the Talk London Forum, our online community where Londoners have their say on London's big issues like housing, the environment, transport, safety, jobs, and more. So we thank you in advance for your questions. Now we are just about ready. So let me introduce, joining us virtually tonight, our London Assembly members. And they are Tony Arbour, who's the Deputy Chair of London Assembly, Janet Arnold, OBE, Sean Bailey, Sean Barry, Andrew Boff, Leonie Cooper, Unmesh Desai, Tony Devnish, Andrew Dismore, Len Duval, Florence Ashlomi MP, Susan Hall, Joanne McCartney, Dr. Alison Moore, Steve O'Connell, Caroline Pigeon, MBE, Keith Prince, Murad Qureshi, Caroline Russell, and Dr. Onkar Sahota. And finally, please welcome your Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, joining for his 9th People's Question Time.
Good evening. Thank you, Navin, and welcome to the first ever online People's Question Time. This event, as the title suggests, is about you rather than me. It's your chance to ask questions about the work we're doing on your behalf. But before we get started, I'd like to touch on some of the major challenges facing our city right now and why I'm determined that I tackle these head on. London gave me the opportunities to go from the council estate where I grew up to being mayor of the greatest city on earth. 4.5 years later, I still wake up every day passionate about delivering the promise I made to Londoners, to make this city a fairer city where everyone can get the opportunities that London gave to me and my family. These last 4 years have been incredibly tough. We've had the horrific Grenfell Tower fire, a series of cowardly terrorist attacks, Brexit, constant government austerity, and now, after all of this, the biggest public health and economic emergency London has faced since the Second World War, which has led to millions of Londoners having to make huge sacrifices for the collective good of our city. But despite these enormous challenges, my passion and belief that we can make London a better, fairer city that works for all Londoners has not been diminished. Of course, we still face some extremely difficult winter months ahead, which have been made far worse by the government's repeated mishandling of this pandemic. But the way Londoners have come together, as well as the recent positive news about the vaccine, means that we can now finally see the light at the end of the tunnel. There is reason to hope. And after the darkness of 2020, we can start to look forward to a better and brighter future. Since the very beginning of the pandemic, my overriding focus has been on keeping Londoners safe from COVID-19. As we now look to the future and a post-COVID world, we're working more and more on how we can support Londoners out of the economic crisis. That's why my mantra at City Hall is now jobs, jobs, jobs. This means doing everything in my power to protect existing jobs and to create as many new ones as possible. And it means laying the foundations for a fair, inclusive, and green economic recovery. Another big part of my job in the coming months will be standing up for Londoners against yet more austerity. Shamefully, the government is using this pandemic as an excuse to hit London's public services, from Transport for London to the police, with a new round of spending cuts. This is the worst possible time for another era of austerity. So I'll be doing everything I can to ensure that rather than cutting back, the government invests more in London to support our economy and to create new jobs. Lastly, I want to touch on a difficult issue that's still very much a top priority for me as mayor, and that's tackling crime. Crime has been falling this year, but we're far from complacent. That's why we're taking strong action to keep crime as low as possible by being tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime. As part of this, I'm recruiting a record number of frontline police officers and funding new activities for young Londoners. Let me just finish with this. We still face a bumpy road ahead and a government that's intent on making life more difficult for people in our city. But we can be optimistic about London's future, because I know that when we come out of this crisis, which we will, we'll still be the best, most amazingly diverse, and most exciting city in the world. a city that can build on all our previous achievements in recent years, from starting a record number of new council homes to tackling air pollution, and a city that's restless to becoming fairer, greener, safer, and more equal. My promise to you is that I'll continue to fight for this vision for our city and continue to stand up for London and the values we hold dear. Thank you. And I'm looking forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for your opening remarks. Now, I'd have my statement as the chair of the London Assembly. I join you today as we face an extraordinary period in our collective history. COVID-19 has had and will continue to have a deep and lasting impact on London. We must stand together, as we have at times of crisis before, to recover and rebuild in a way that makes our capital an even better place to live, work, and visit. The pandemic has transformed our way of life. It has worsened existing problems for the most disadvantaged and vulnerable, and that includes a disproportionate impact on Black, Asian, minority, and ethnic communities. It has hit us hard and our economy hard as well. But it has also shown the strength in London and our ability to unite when it is most needed. So tonight, I would like to pay tribute to all of London's heroes. To start with, the NHS and emergency workers on the front line, the transport workers and delivery drivers who kept our city moving, the faith and community leaders who have supported London's diverse communities, and last but not the least, the volunteers who have stepped in to cook meals, check in on their neighbors, and provide support. In June, Assembly members pledged to stand together, shoulder to shoulder with London's Black communities in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. We must play a role in ensuring racism and discrimination are challenged and eradicated. And I must say that I'm proud to support Mayor's commitment to tackle structural and institutional racism across London. Going forward, let me assure you the London Assembly will monitor this pledge to ensure that the real progress is made. Equality and opportunity are for all Londoners, not just for a select few. The London Assembly represents you. We are here to hold the Mayor to account, to challenge his decisions where appropriate, and to make sure that he fulfills his pledges made to Londoners. That's why we have exposed the alarming fact that some Londoners cannot get a home test for COVID-19 as they are invisible on the credit system. We have therefore asked that the Mayor raises this issue with the government as a matter of urgency. And we continue to examine in detail the impact of COVID-19 on different aspects of London, such as transport for London's finances and the delivery of major infrastructure projects like Crossrail, Londoners' livelihoods and job security, the future of the hospitality and creative industries, and the vitality of our local high streets. Beyond COVID-19, fire safety of cladding in blocks is a pressing issue for thousands of Londoners. We have called on the Mayor to establish Housing Task Force to help the Londoners who cannot obtain fire review or EWS1 forms. These rules, brought in after the Grenfell fire tragedy, means that many Londoners are effectively trapped in their homes, unable to move or remortgage their properties. And we have highlighted the alarming fact that reports of rape and sexual offences in London increased by 25% between 2015 and 2020, but the convictions dropped by almost a quarter, and this is clearly not acceptable. This year marks 20 years of the establishment of the GLA and the London Assembly. I'm proud of the way in which our work has shaped London over this period. As we look ahead to London's recovery in the next 20 years, we reiterate our call for greater devolution to London, and we commit to working on behalf of you and with the Mayor to make our city a better place for all Londoners. Once again, thank you for joining us tonight, and we look forward to answering your questions this evening. So we now proceed to the aspect of the questions to the members and the Mayor. We will now begin taking questions in the following order: transport, followed by safety, then air quality and environment, housing, followed by growing London's economy, and the last sector will be anything else that is not covered. For example, education, health and culture, or whatever you want to raise which is relevant to London. Questions about COVID-19 will be taken throughout the event, whichever sections they best fit. For each topic, we will take 2 live questions, 1 recorded question, and as many questions as we can from the live chat. Some features tonight will only be available to pre-registered audience members. Please be sure to register next time if you're watching and wish to use the live chat. For those of you who have pre-registered and want to use the chat to ask your questions, these are the instructions. The chat is for questions only, please, rather than comments, to allow us to focus on answering as many of your questions as possible tonight. Comments will not be made visible. Try to ask questions on the topic being discussed at the right time, as otherwise they may be missed. Remember to keep your questions short. I will be asking the Mayor and the London Assembly members to keep their answers short as well and to the point, so that we can fit as many questions as we can, which is the purpose of this whole event tonight. Most importantly, you can like other people's questions so that they have the most likes that will be asked first, assuming they are on topic and have not already been asked. So it is now the time to hear your questions. Our first topic tonight is transport. You can start adding your questions on this topic into the chat box now. May I firstly invite Daniel Slipper from London Borough of Redbridge, who will ask our first question.
Good evening. What is being done to improve the infrastructure of the underground system to ensure we have a transport network suitable for a world-class city?
Mr. Mayor, over to you first.
Thank you for your question, which is a really important one. So as a city, our population is, roughly speaking, 9 million. But before the pandemic, it grew to about 10 million, more than 10 million, because people are coming into our city. And you're absolutely right. We've got to not be worried about the growth, but plan for that. And that means investing in our infrastructure. So we have been working on our plans to increase the capacity of public transport, because our ambition is to go from about 64% of Londoners walking, cycling, using public transport, up to 80% over the next few years. And so what we've been investing in is a number of projects to increase the ability of London to cope with additional commuters by investing in infrastructure. I'll give you just 3 examples of some of that investment that's continuing, even during this pandemic, and even with the government cutting the money for Transport for London. The first one are the improvements to Bank Station, one of the busiest stations across Europe. The plans we have to improve Bank will continue and are continuing during this lockdown period as well, with safe construction taking place. The second example of improving infrastructure, which is continuing during this pandemic, is the Northern Line extension south towards the development around Battersea Power Station and Nine Elms. Really important to increase public transport capacity and infrastructure to get more people in the new homes getting from their homes to work. And the third example I can give you in relation to our commitment to invest in infrastructure is we've ordered new trains for the Piccadilly line, a really important line that goes across our city. And the new trains which we've ordered will lead to more passengers being able to use the Piccadilly line. And one of the things that I'm seeking to do is to explain to the government why actually investing in our shovel-ready projects leads to jobs being created in London, but also across the country as well. One of the best examples of that is not simply Crossrail, which is creating jobs in London, but across the country. But the trains that are being built for the Piccadilly line are being built in the northeast and the northwest, which is really important for making sure that we have a green recovery coming out of this pandemic.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have an indication from Assembly Member Caroline Pigeon. Would you please want to go ahead with your answer?
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Daniel, for that really important question. There is a big debate at the moment about what we can afford to do. And I have to say the debate is too much focused on, can we afford to invest in transport infrastructure? We can't not afford to invest in it. We absolutely need to be putting the money in. And I'm very concerned that the government has an agenda of so-called levelling up with the rest of the country, where we need the investment in London. It creates jobs around the country, but we need London to keep moving. We haven't got the funding to do things like the Piccadilly line signalling upgrade we desperately need. We haven't secured the final money needed to get Crossrail open. But more than that, we need to have money going into cycling and walking infrastructure in London, and to make sure some of these projects which look like they could be delayed, whether it's the Sutton tram, the tube extension to Lewisham and so on, we must make sure they're invested in. And my one criticism of the current mayor is that one of his priorities is to build the Silvertown Tunnel, a project that's going to cost up to £2 billion up to 2050. In my view, it's the wrong priority. I want to see investment in public transport rather than motorways under the Thames.
Thank you very much. We'd like now to move on to the next question. And that is from Vishal Shah, my namesake, from London Borough of Harrow, who will ask a question on transport. Vishal, please go ahead.
Thank you. I've noticed increase in the number of cycling lanes locally, but they often start and end in the middle of a very busy road, which is very dangerous for cyclists, particularly new ones like myself, as well as for motorists, because you have cyclists coming out of cycle lanes in the middle. There is also an increase in the low traffic neighborhoods, I believe, to reduce pollution, which is a great idea. But the side effect of that is that traffic on all the other roads around my area has actually gone up. So a 10-minute journey now takes me 30 minutes to do, because everybody's sitting there idling their cars. So, and with local boroughs promoting local high streets, my question is the long-term plan to get people to stay local and not commute to their town centres? Thank you.
Mr. Mayor.
That's a cracking question, which has a number of issues, which I'll try and unpack as soon as I can, because otherwise the chair may not unreasonably criticise me for taking too long. I'm like you, by the way. I've recently restarted cycling again. I did as a young boy in London, but I've restarted cycling again. And I feel safer doing so because of the investment we've made in cycling in London, as Caroline referred to earlier on. And so before the pandemic began, we'd managed to treble the amount of segregated cycling in London. When I became mayor, we had 50 kilometres. That was done in the last 8 years. We got to 150 in just 4 years. In the last few months, we've added another 90 kilometres of cycle lanes, which is really important. We've got to make sure it's safe. One of the really horrible figures I want to share with you is in the last full year for which we have figures, 125 Londoners died on our streets They were pedestrians, they were cyclists, they were on motorbikes mainly, and 1 and 2 in car, road traffic accidents. We've got to make cycling safer. So a lot of our investment is making cycling safer. A lot of our investment is making sure we have 20 miles per hour speed limits on all our roads, TfL roads, but persuading councils to do the same as well. We now have more than 300 school streets, making it safer in and around schools. We've made sure that our bus lanes are 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to make sure that traffic flows better through London and people are more confident using our buses, more cycle parking spaces, more pavement facilities as well. What you're referring to is something called low traffic neighbourhoods. And what the government did was the government said to councils across London, there are 32 boroughs plus the City of London. They said, look, we've got this money available, but you must spend it by October. And so what the councils did, not unreasonably, was getting their applications quickly, getting their schemes quickly, because unless they got their schemes in quickly, they wouldn't have got the money from government. And some of the schemes from some councils aren't perfect. And so what some councils have done is tweak those schemes to realise there are some challenges posed by their schemes. Some councils have decided to pull the plug on their schemes because there were too many issues with their schemes. But most of the councils, and I support them, have continued with their low traffic neighbourhood schemes. Why? Because we've got to avoid at all costs a car-led recovery. Our City of London doesn't have the space to have additional lorries, additional vans, additional cars clogging up our streets. That leads to congestion, worse air quality, but our emergency services, our delivery trucks, our buses not being able to use our streets. And so what we're trying to do is to create the environment where we have active travel and more Londoners been able to walk, cycle and use public transport. And here's the good news. In the last few months, we've seen more than a 20% increase in people cycling and more people walking as well. And what I'm hoping as we come out of the pandemic is that more and more people get out of their cars and use other ways to get about our city. And we've launched a new app, Navin, the TfL Go app, which I'd advise everyone watching to download now. It's a fantastic app which gives you really good advice about alternative ways to get around our great city.
Thank you. Assembly Member Prince, you have indicated you want to reply to this as well, please.
Thank you, Chair. I think what we've learned in relation to the low traffic neighbourhoods is the old saying you can act in haste, but you repent at leisure. And we've seen a lot of these low traffic neighbourhoods being taken out in Wandsworth, in Redbridge, which is part of my patch, all over Lewisham have been reduced. I think that whilst what the Mayor said was accurate in the fact that the government set a very tight timeline, nobody forced these boroughs to take the money. And it was really the role of TfL to help and advise these boroughs. And I think in that respect, TfL have let some of these boroughs down, because at the end of the day, we have to remember this is all public money, and a lot of money has been spent on these low traffic neighbourhoods, and all those that have been ripped out means that is money that has been completely wasted. And I think that is a real problem. So what I would say is, yes, of course, I welcome anything that encourages people to cycle and walk. I'm a cyclist myself. I'm also a motorcyclist, one of the most vulnerable road users. I've supported the low traffic neighbourhoods in my area where the residents are for it. But the lesson to be learnt here is that we must have proper consultation before either local government or the GLA or even national government go around forcing amendments on people. You know, we live in a democracy, and it's very important that we recognise that and that we listen to the residents before we make changes in their roads.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Shah, for your question. We now move on to the third question, which will be from Loriana Sester from the Borough of Tower Hamlets. Can you please go ahead with your question?
Hello, my name is Loriana Chester from the London Borough of Tower Hamlets. My question regards transport. When will over 60s be able to use their passes on transport before 9 a.m. again? There are far less people on public transport now, so it doesn't make sense to penalise over 60s who are being asked to pay to travel before 9 a.m. so as to discourage them from travelling at that time to make room for workers who can't work from home. I am 65 and can't work from home, and now have to front the extra expense for travel. Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, if you want to respond to this, please.
Well, thank you for that question. It's an issue that's dear to my heart. So the government gave us a 6-month grant in May because as a consequence of this pandemic, we had more than 90% of people not using the tube and buses who did before. So we lost a revenue stream that paid for our services. So we needed the government to support us during the pandemic. One of the conditions the government attached to the first half of the deal, the first part of the year, was to remove free travel for over 60s before 9 o'clock, as you said. They also wanted us to remove free travel for all under 18-year-olds as well. I resisted those conditions, and most recently, the government said, in fact, we want you to remove all free travel, not just before 9 a.m., all free travel for over 60s, and remove all free travel for under 18s. They also try to impose other conditions, like extending the congestion charge to the North Circular and South Circular, and increasing the fares way above inflation. And I resisted as your mayor. So here's the good news. I've said no to the government. You will not take away free travel from older Londoners. I've said no to the government. You will not take away free travel from our children. And I've said no to the government. You will not make us increase fares way above inflation from January. But I'm afraid I wasn't able to persuade them to restore free travel for over 60s before 9 a.m. So the bad news is, during this pandemic, when we haven't got passengers using our buses, our tubes, our trams, or our overgrounds to pay for the services we provide, for obvious reasons, Londoners are doing the right thing. We'll need to continue curtailing what you've always experienced, which is free travel before 9 a.m. But the good news is, thanks to us fighting for London, that free travel won't be taken away after 9 a.m.
Thank you. Assembly Member Moore, would you like to respond to this question?
Thank you very much, Chair. I am very concerned about, as many are, about any plans to take away free travel for the over 60s, and indeed very much for the under 18s. The government seem to be pursuing an agenda of levelling down as opposed to levelling up with the rest of the country. And I think one of the challenges we face in London is we've got the highest child poverty level in the country, the city with the highest child poverty, and the joint highest pensioner poverty. And that free travel is critical in a city where we don't want to go back to a car-led recovery. And actually, we have the lowest car ownership of a city in the country. So that free travel is absolutely crucial. And punishing Londoners for doing the right thing and staying off the tube and creating the challenge that we have had for Transport for London is just unreasonable. And it is there's a danger that it'll hit over 60s and under 18s very particularly hard. So thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And can I thank Loriana for her question, please? We will now move to questions taken directly from the live chat. I would read out the 3 top live questions. The first one is, and we've only got about 4 minutes left, so let's try and squeeze in at least 2 questions. Not long ago, we were advised or encouraged to go for diesel car until recently when it became not environmentally friendly. Is there any scrap scheme in place to help the average poor London worker towards a better vehicle? And that is a question from Tony in Havering. Mr. Mayor, your very quick response, please.
Thank you for your question, Tony. Yes, we have a scrappage scheme to help Londoners on low income to move them away from polluting vehicles to vehicles that are ultra low emission zone compliant. The bad news is we've not managed to persuade the government to give us any support to do so. The reason why, by the way, Tony, we're asking Londoners to not use either old petrol vehicles or the older diesel vehicles is they emit nitrogen dioxide, nitrogen oxide, particulate matter and carbon, which are really damaging to people's health. Children have permanent underdeveloped lungs. Adults have a whole host of health issues from asthma to cancer and heart disease. And the good news is, as a consequence of the ultra-low emission zone, we've seen a 97% reduction in schools in areas where the air is illegal for nitrogen dioxide, and a 94% reduction in Londoners living in areas where the air is illegal. So the policies are working, and because of City Hall's scrappage scheme, you can benefit to move away from a polluting vehicle, and I'll continue to try and persuade the government to do the right thing and support us as well.
Assembly Member Devenish, if you'd like to come in very, very quickly, please.
I'll be very quick, Chair. Good evening, Mr. Mayor. Always a pleasure. You started by talking about jobs, and for once we can agree. So will you reconsider allowing Londoners, and my West End in particular, to have 4 free Saturdays before Christmas to save jobs of the West End retailers and Londoners who really need these jobs? Thank you.
Let's move on to the next question, and that is from Nikhil Venukuru from Borough of Westminster. Will the congestion zone be expanding? Won't that worsen congestion?
Well, Nikhil, thanks for your question. You're absolutely right to raise this issue. Dr. Moore earlier on talked about the government punishing Londoners for doing the right thing. Another example of the government punishing Londoners is they wanted me to extend the congestion charge up to the North Circular and down to the South Circular, which would have meant 4 million more Londoners having to pay £15 a day to use their cars. I'll give you an example, Nikhil. If you're a teacher who lives in Tooting but was driving to Lewisham because that was the best way to get to your school, you'd be paying an additional £3,000 a year because of this government. But Nikhil, I fought the government and I said no. And so the good news is we've defeated the government and killed off their plans to extend the congestion charge to the North Circular and South Circular. And as long as I'm mayor, I'll continue to fight the government against extending the congestion charge.
Thank you, Nikhil, for your question. We are, I'm afraid, out of time on transport section. If we didn't get to answer your specific question, the online feedback form, which will be emailed to registered audience members, and that will explain how to submit your question to get a reply after the event from the mayor or the assembly members. Let's move on swiftly now to the next topic, which is on safety, which includes any questions about community safety, policing, crime, COVID safety, and indeed London Fire Brigade. Don't forget for our registered audience members to like questions in the chat that you most want us to answer, or add your questions now on safety only. Can I welcome Maureen Marshall from the London Borough of Bromley, who will ask our first question on safety. Maureen, please go ahead.
Thank you. Good evening, Mr. Khan. What would you do to improve the relationship between the police and the black community?
Mr. Mayor.
Maureen, thank you very much for your question. So this summer we saw a number of things happening which have brought this matter to the fore. We saw the brutal killing of George Floyd in America, but this is not an issue that's unique to Minnesota or Minneapolis. We saw the Black Lives Matter movement campaigning across the globe. And we also saw evidence of the disproportionate way COVID is affecting our Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities. And what's really important is for us to realise that the trust and confidence of Black Londoners, as far as the police is concerned, isn't as good as it should be, and it's far less than other communities. So what we're doing is we've spent the last few weeks, the Deputy Mayor for Policing and Crime, the Deputy Mayor for Social Integration and Communities, Dr. Debbie Weeks-Bernard, Sophie Linden, and myself, having more than 400 separate engagements with individuals, community groups, activists across our city, with the police, to hear from them the sort of issues that concerns Black Londoners. And by the way, this is an issue that should concern all of us, because if it's the case that some Londoners feel they can't trust the police, they're not going to come forward and report crime. They're not going to come forward and be witnesses in a prosecution. They're not going to come forward and join the police service. So it affects all of us if some part of our community doesn't have confidence in the police. Flowing from those meetings is an action plan we've been working on for the last few weeks, which we're hoping to launch very soon. That action plan has the support of the police and will set out in a number of areas the things that need to happen to try and improve the trust and confidence. I'll give you some examples of the things we're looking at, Maureen. The use of force by the police, the use of stop and search, the use of handcuffs is another example. Another issue is, does the police service properly represent the city that it seeks to police? Another issue are the checks and balances that take place in the police service. That being said, I've got to say this. I'm really proud to be the mayor of a city where I think we've got the best police service in the world. There's been huge progress made over the last 20 years since the Stephen Lawrence report and since I was growing up in the 70s and 80s. But we have to recognise, even though our police service may be the best police service in the world, it ain't perfect. And as far as Black Londoners are concerned, there needs to be huge improvements. I'm hoping with the action plan being published, we'll be walking the walk to show Black Londoners in particular how the police and City Hall can make a greater effort to improve the trust and confidence of Black Londoners.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Can I please ask the members and the Mayor to be very succinct so that we can get as many questions as we can. Assembly Member Sean Bailey has indicated he wants to respond. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. The relationship between the Black community and the police in London has been fractious for years, but the real thing the Mayor needs to concentrate on, since he's become the Mayor, London has become less safe. We've had an 11-year high in homicides and knife crime has gone up 39%. So if you really want to repair the relationship with the Black community, there's three things he needs to do. Firstly, he needs to do something significantly different to combat knife crime compared to what he did before lockdown. Secondly, he has to do much more about the recruitment and retention of Black officers in order to bridge the gap between the police. And of course, he's got to send the message that he's on the police's side by providing them with the right equipment so they can do stop and search properly, and provide them with new technology so they can search many more people without the aggravation factor of actually being stopped. That will go some of the way to helping the Black community have more confidence in the police. But arguably, we need a mayor who provides more leadership, and we need police who investigate crimes no matter which community they happen in.
Thank you. Let's move on to the next question. Good evening, Lynette Martin, who is from Hammersmith and Fulham. Council, can you please go ahead and ask your question, please, Lynette?
Yes, good evening. The carrying and use of knives and guns seems to be a normal occurrence by mostly young men, some, often linked to gangs, drug dealing and poverty. Are there any new ideas or tried and tested schemes that have worked in other cities that we could look at to significantly reduce this awful violent crime?
Mr. Mayor, please answer the question.
Thanks, Lynette, for your really important question. You've shown a level of sophistication and understanding that I'm afraid Sean Bailey fails to understand. You can't have a situation where the police have lost £1 billion from their budget, where youth clubs across our city have closed down, where youth workers have lost their job, where inequalities have increased, where deprivation has increased, where there is less opportunity for young people, and be too surprised when there's an increase in crime across our city. And when you listen to police officers will tell you there is a direct link between the cuts in preventative services, the cuts in policing and the increase in violent crime. Leonard, you heard during my opening me talking about the importance of being tough on crime, which is why we've had record investment from City Hall and the police at a time when the government's cutting, but also being tough on the causes of crime. And that's why I'm really proud, Lynette, that I'm the mayor who, when the government's been cutting youth club money, I've invested £70 million in a Young Londoners Fund to give young people constructive things to do. There could be after-school clubs, there could be youth clubs, they could be supporting teachers in schools, they could be in culture, they could be in sports, they could be in education. At the same time, Lynette, we've made sure that London has England's first violence reduction unit, because we think we should have a public health approach when it comes to the issue of violent crime. We should be treating crime like we would a public health issue. That means you try and deal with the infection, the violent crime, stop the infection spreading, young people joining a criminal gang, but stopping the infection occurring in the first place. And that's why, for example, we in City Hall have invested in a rescue and response fund to support young people who get sucked into what's called county lines, the criminal gangs. And the other thing we're doing, which is really important, is to reduce the numbers of young Londoners excluded from mainstream education and diverted to pupil referral units, which end up being places where gang leaders hang around outside to recruit them to join criminal gangs. Look, no young person is born a gang member or born with a knife in their hand. We've got to make sure that we invest in young people so they can have their potential fulfilled. It's like what I call the London promise. You work hard, you get a helping hand, you can achieve anything. I'm afraid over the last 10 years, there's been too much cutting and not enough helping hand from the government.
Thank you. I've got Assembly Member Sean Berry who wants to answer the question. Please go ahead.
Yes, and I think the question asks a really sensible thing, which is, are there any new ideas? And I think the big new idea, the one that's come through during this mayoral term, thanks to pushing from people like me, from campaigners who've been looking at the cuts to youth services, the impact of austerity on people's lives, driving crime in the way the mayor has laid out, is the public health approach. Now, the mayor didn't start out with this. His initial police and crime plan didn't pursue a public health approach to reducing the causes of crime in the way that his policies now do. And I think that's the difference. Citizen engagement, assembly members like me getting the evidence together, showing, for example, that there's been £35 million cut out of youth services across London, that 100 youth centres have closed. When the mayor saw that evidence coming from us, coming from Londoners, he had to act. And I think it shows the benefits of having Londoners engaged with important issues like this, and a mayor who will actually listen. We are making progress. But the other thing we've seen under this current mayor is a massive rise in stop and search. And I think, as Sean Bailey pointed out, there hasn't been a reduction in crime despite this massive increase in stop and search. We know that stop and search doesn't work. There is a correlation between the loss of youth services and the increase in crime. That's the thing we're trying to rectify now with this new approach, and that's the right thing to do. I think increasing stop and search has potentially been almost counterproductive. We know the tensions there are in our black communities. They're much more stopped and searched, much more disproportionately than they are in the population. This is something that we have to do something about. But I think we are taking a much better approach now than we were at the beginning of this mayoralty, thanks to Londoners, thanks to campaigners, and thanks to good opposition from the London Assembly.
Thank you. Assembly Member Desai, would you like to come in for a very, very brief moment, please? Thank you.
Yes, sure. Thank you very much. Look, let's get some facts straight. The budgetary position that the Met finds itself in. Over the last 10 years, as a result of austerity cuts, the Met's budget has been cut by £1 billion. Is this mayor or Mayor Sadiq Khan, who in this latest budget has actually invested, put an extra £100 million of money into tackling violent crime, with half of this being provided to the Met and the other half to preventative programs to the Violence Reduction Unit. Concrete action from a mayor tackling crime. And again, I think in reference to an earlier question about what the mayor is doing about violent crime, the mayor has outlined some measures, but if I can just say, a new violent crime task force chair of 272 officers, new violence suppression units made up of 620 officers based on the most high crime areas across London, investing more in policing each year of his mayoralty than the previous mayor did in any of their last 4 years, of £45 million Young Londoners Fund to particularly help young people at risk of getting caught up in crime, establishment of violent reduction units to drive a public health approach to knife crime, increasing the number of safer school officers to help drive down knife crime in schools, and creation of the first mayoral knife crime plan and a knife crime action plan for each of London's 32 boroughs. And yes, relationships between between the Met and London's black communities has got to be addressed. There is a mayoral action plan coming out. Let's see what's in the action plan. The Labour members of the Assembly take this issue very seriously. I launched a report last month, Policing with Consent, which looks at the areas that the Met does need to address: recruitment, retention, training, operational practices, and community engagement. Let's wait and see what's in the mayor action plan. I'm sure that that action plan will address these issues in a very direct way for the benefit of all Londoners.
Thank you very much. Can I thank the resident for the question? We'll move on to the third question on safety, which is from Mijanur Rahman from London Borough of Redbridge.
Hello, my name is Mijanur Rahman from the London Borough of Redbridge, and my question to the Mayor is, what are you doing to keep the young Londoners safe from the coronavirus?
Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much for your question. So a number of things in relation to young people and coronavirus. I think actually young people have had a really tough time over the last 8 months with the exam fiasco, with issues around university halls of residence and the virus spreading, but also with the lockdown having a real impact on the mental health of young people. So the advice to all Londoners, whether you're young or older, is to follow the rules in this second lockdown. By the way, the second lockdown and the second wave was not inevitable. One of the reasons why we are where we are is because of the government's failure to get a grip with the test, trace, isolate support system. So here's the good news going forward. 20 boroughs in London have managed to get an agreement from the government to have mass testing in their boroughs. 10,000 mass testing per borough with the ability to increase. They've not got the test yet. One thing we want to do is to make sure those boroughs are using the test to those parts of their community that needs them the most. And one of those areas are going to be university students returning home, or those universities returning back to their halls of residence in January after the Christmas holidays. The second big issue is December the 2nd is the date when the national lockdown is lifted. I was in a meeting today with public health experts to work out what the criteria will be to decide which tier we go into, medium, high, very high, once the lockdown is lifted as well. You saw the figures over the course of the last week. We've had the biggest increase in unemployment of young people in any quarter for the last 30 years. The last time in one quarter of a year, unemployment was this high for young people was in 1992. And that's why we've got to make sure that people realize that the health consequences of this pandemic for young people are linked with the economic consequences for young people as well. So your health is linked to your wealth. We've got to make sure we don't have huge mass unemployment for young people at a time when the government's been slow to respond to the economic consequences as well.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. We need to move on. May I just thank Mijanoor for his question. The next question comes from our telephone line for Londoners who prefer to call in their questions or without internet access. This question is from Mohammed Sheikh from the London Borough of Merton, who is asking, according to one of the Assembly members, under Sadiq Khan's mayorship, 12,033 homes in London have been burgled, which is up by 36%. 38 police stations across London have also been closed. What does the Mayor and the London Assembly intend to do about it? Thank you, Mohammed.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mohammed. I never like disagree with Londoners unless they're wrong. So I've got the latest figures for burglary now versus 2016. And burglary offences have actually reduced in the last 4 years. But one burglary is one burglary too many. When you speak to the victims of burglary, it's a really traumatic experience because it's an invasion of your home, a stranger has been inside your home, going through your personal possessions. And many people who are burgled are traumatized for many weeks and months after they've been burgled. So what we've done, Mohammed, is notwithstanding the £1 billion worth of cuts from the government, we from City Hall have been investing money to give the Met Police additional tools. So they've got tools now to mark residents' property, which means for a burglar, sometimes stealing those properties is not worth it because they're marked with special ink that we're providing the police with. We've also made sure in some parts of London where there's high burglary rates, where it's one of their local priorities, there's additional resources in those parts of London. What we used to have before I became mayor is 8 crude targets across London. What we've done instead of that, Mohammed, is have some pan-London targets, but some local borough targets as well. And in those boroughs where burglary is an issue, there's additional resources to help in burglary as well. And that's what's led to a reduction in burglary in big numbers in those boroughs where it's a concern, but still across London over the last 4 years, a reduction. But I'll make no apologies for the fact that I in City Hall am invested in our policing, as Unmesh Desai said, because of our budget from City Hall, there'll be an additional 1,300 officers there wouldn't be before. But also we're trying to put back the hollowing out of the back office function. Forensics are really important when it comes to investigating burglaries. Invested in closed circuit TV, CCTV, really important, and invested in officers and back office staff in police stations as well. And by the way, Navin, it's really important.
Wind up, Mr. Mayor, please.
That one of the reasons why we're having to make tough choices on police stations, we've closed half the number as Boris Johnson, was because the choice is to pay for bricks and mortar or police officers, and I'm choosing police officers rather than bricks and mortar.
Thank you. We are out of time on this section, but I take one question from live chat, and that is on masks. The question is from Michael Phillips from Borough of Camden. He says, I don't see anyone enforcing the mask covering rules mandated by the government in stores or public transportation. These are mostly young people who can't all be possible exempt. This is endangering people's lives. What is the city going to do to improve this situation? Mr. Mayor, in a couple of sentences, please. Thank you.
Well, firstly, I think we've all got to accept responsibility for doing our bit to try and stop the virus spreading. The good news is there's been a slowdown in the virus spreading across most of London. I'll share with you some enforcement numbers. By the way, both the Met Police Service, British Transport Police, Transport London enforcement officers are enforcing, but explaining, educating and encouraging before that. I'll give you some numbers just so you are confident about enforcement. The Met Police Service have issued more than 1,000 fixed penalty notices, and there are big fines for those who are persistent offenders taking risks with Londoners' safety. The British Transport Police and TfL enforcement officers have issued almost 1,000 fixed penalty notices, and they've spoken to almost 120,000 commuters, including many commuters they've asked to leave TfL, and some commuters have stopped coming on as well. In relation to shops, many shops have signs up as well, but it's really important all of us wear a face mask when we're in close proximity to somebody else. Me wearing a face mask keeps you safe. You wearing a face mask keeps me safe. It's one of the most unselfish things you can do.
Thank you. We now move on to air quality and the environment section. For those who are interested, start adding your questions on this topic into the chat box now. Can I welcome, first of all, Christoph Brunn from Newham, who will be asking our first question. Please go forward, Christoph.
Good evening. When it comes to recycling, London is by far the worst performing region in the country. And my borough, Newham, has the lowest recycling rate nationally at only 17%, which as a proud and environmentally conscious Londoner, I'm frankly appalled and embarrassed by. London should be aiming to be a national leader in this area, but instead we are languishing at the bottom of the pile. So why is London so far behind the rest of the country when it comes to recycling? And what are London's plans to significantly improve our recycling performance?
Mr. Mayor.
Christoph, thank you for your really important question. This is linked with the issue of the climate emergency that we face. When I became mayor, I looked into why it was we were bottom of this league table, as you suggested. There are lots of explanations for this. One of them is we have more flats in our city than other parts of the country, more homes in multiple occupancy, and less ability to have curbside collections. Another explanation I was given, Christoph, when I became mayor, is we have 32 boroughs in the City of London, and they've got separate contracts when it comes to refuse collection, sometimes long contracts of 5 or 10 years. Some boroughs collect 6 separate dry materials, some boroughs just in one bag, and no food collection as well. Christoph, what we've tried to do is, because we've got no powers over these boroughs, work with the boroughs to try and make sure when it comes to them renewing their contracts or amending their contracts, rectify us being bottom of the league table. And one of the ways we've done that is by having all boroughs have a reduction and recycling plan. Really important for us to use the bully pit of City Hall to persuade councils to do far, far more. And we've also made sure, working with the London Waste and Recycling Board, we have as much of our waste as possible recycled. And you know the mantra better than I do, probably, the 3 R's, reduce, reuse, and recycle. The Assembly's done a great job. Councillor Leonie Cooper is regularly reminding me, but also chivying councils to do much more. She often names and shames bad councils and names and praises good ones. So the light's gone up, so I'm not moving. I'm in City Hall. Apologies for that. And so we need to do more. And so any influence you can bring on your councils will help as well. But just to reassure you, Christoph, some councils are trying to do the right thing, but the issue is too many flats in their boroughs rather than the sort of homes that are by the road.
Thank you. Assembly Member Cooper, do you want to respond to the question on recycling?
Well, thanks very much. And thank you, Mr. Mayor, for saying that I have done a lot of work on this. And it's not just Newham, Christoph, over in southwest London. Wandsworth is 341st out of 345 local authorities. And I think the Mayor and the Deputy Mayor have done an awful lot of work in trying to encourage the boroughs to separate out food waste, because that's a big, heavy, volatile thing that if we all take it out and separate it out, we don't need to be sending that off along with the rest of our waste. And the more that people are encouraged to separate their waste, the more likely they are to do that and to separate out the 6 dry recyclates that the Mayor was just mentioning. And that's exactly the kind of encouragement that we need for us in the domestic setting at home, but also supporting businesses. And there's been work done on that as well. The Trifocal programme has been working with business. And I think it's really important to remember that the recycling needs to improve, not just in the domestic setting, but also in businesses. And that's something that councils, working together with the Mayor and the Mayor's team, really needs to get more messaging out there, because the more we're reminded about this, the more likely we are to do that separation and to reduce the amount of waste. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Christoph, for your question. We now move on to the second question, which is from Michael Doyle from Kensington and Chelsea. Michael, please go ahead with your question.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Mayor, London has a congestion charge to encourage people to use their vehicles less. We also have a low emission zone to encourage people to switch to cleaner vehicles. My question concerns excessive vehicle noise. Noise is a pollutant, just like harmful air emissions. It induces stress and it's harmful to a mental and physical health. We need to encourage drivers to switch to quieter, less stress-inducing vehicles. And this would benefit all Londoners, and it'd benefit our pets and also the city's diverse wildlife. Would the Mayor consider a noise emission surcharge for vehicles based on their decibels emitted over a certain threshold?
Mr. Mayor?
So thank you very much for your question. When you began your question, I thought you were going to talk about the noise from some of our tubes, particularly at night, but you raised a separate issue, which is really important. The noise from vehicles is a particular issue with, and I'm not making a generalization for the sake of it, but some motorcycles and some heavy goods vehicles as well, and some vehicles, the older diesel ones. Some of the MOT testing does address the issue of the noise, but not all of it does. You're right, some vehicles are loud. In fact, one of the things that made me smile when you asked a question is we've, at a meeting I was at recently, there was a concern raised that some vehicles in London are silent because they're electric, which can lead to increased risk of pedestrians not hearing a vehicle, particularly if there's issues in relation to them being visually impaired. And there's been a discussion about how we make quiet vehicles loud so people who are visually impaired can hear them. But you're right to raise the issue of noise pollution. We're exploring all the tools in our toolkit to make all vehicles, whether it's road vehicles, tubes, or others, less loud. I'm not sure a noise surcharge is the way forward for a variety of complicated reasons I won't go into, not least the difficulty in doing so. But what I will do, I'll take away, Navin, with your permission, this issue with TfL. What I could do, Navin, is if the questioner wouldn't mind giving to colleagues in City Hall his details, what I'll make sure I do is get the technical team in TfL to work directly with him to let him know some of the things we're doing and some of the things on the horizon in relation to the Mayor's transport strategy, which is more of a longer term strategy about some of these challenges that we face going forward.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm sure we can get the comms team or appropriate to take this up. Thank you, Michael, for your question. Our third question will come from Elora Martin from the London Borough of Barnet. Elora, please go ahead with your question.
Hello, my name is Elora Martinez from the London Borough of Barnet. I was wondering if any other pedestrian day will take place in London, because enjoying a day without any car in the center of the city is the best experience I had so far. Thank you very much for your answer.
Mr. Mayor, over to you again.
I've got to apologise to all the other questioners. That might be my favourite question of the night so far. In 2019, we had the biggest ever car-free day our city's seen, and you're right, it was a fantastic day. It was great to see us looking at the possibilities there are with fewer cars across our city. And it was a great day. We had big plans for 2020 to have, for those that aren't aware, it occurs in September 21st, or thereabouts, the Sunday. We had bigger plans for 2020, but I'm afraid the pandemic led to challenges about whether we could do it. So what we had instead was 2 weeks worth of online activities to encourage people to use their cars less. And that's why in answer to a previous question, I talked about our street space program. We trebled the amount of cycling lanes before the pandemic. We've more than quadrupled now. It's now fivefold from what it was since I became mayor, an additional 90 kilometres. But also, we've got a huge amount of additional space for walking. We've increased our pavements as well. I'm looking forward to 2021 September, us being way at the other side of this pandemic and having an even bigger car-free day. The good news is, because more and more boroughs in London have school streets, have good examples of low traffic neighbourhoods, have good examples of closing off their streets to either all vehicles or to only allow those vehicles that are zero emission, I think our possibilities in 2021 are even bolder than they were in 2019. So watch this space about 2021. But it really is quite exciting to just imagine the possibility with a bit of boldness and planning in advance.
Thank you. Assembly Member Caroline Russell, your response, please.
Thank you, Chair. And this is my favourite question too. I think a city that works for people who are walking is a city that works for everyone. And we don't just need one-off pedestrian days. We need to make sure that our city works for people who are walking every single day. And that means having quieter streets, having less traffic, cleaner air, and making sure that those roads are safe, easy to cross the road, and also that the pavements are smooth and easy to get along, whether you're walking with a white cane, whether you're using a wheelchair or pushing a pram. And I think the other thing that comes out of this is that the more that we focus on walking in our city and cycling, but especially walking, the more we can do to clean up our air. We've had data out this week that has shown that schools all across London are still exposed to dirty air, despite the good work that the Mayor's been doing on bringing in an ultra low emission zone. But we're still not doing enough. So it means we actually need to do more to bring down that pollution in the first place. And that means doing more to reduce driving. And that's why things like the Silvertown Tunnel, where the Mayor has committed Londoners to paying £65 million a year for a quarter of a century into the future, locking in driving, pollution, congestion. That's why the Mayor's decision was very wrong on Silvertown.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Laura, for your question. Let's move to the top three light questions from the chat. And those are, I've got one from Edward Dickinson from Barking and Dagenham, with studies around the world proving that citizens' assemblies are the most progressive, representative and forward-thinking model of governance, which is the only way that we can actually protect ourselves from climate apocalypse. Would you support a citizens' assembly to replace the London mayoral position to give the citizens executive powers over the future and the future of the planet? I'll read the next question. What green measures that are currently enforced due to the pandemic will be retained when this is over? And that is from Sean Brady from Bromley. And the last question I have here is, what does the Mayor think is acceptable to allow, why does the Mayor think it acceptable to allow the go-ahead to both a second incinerator at Belvedere and the building of the Silvertown Tunnel when the effects of air pollution are so adverse to health in East and South East London, as well as accelerating the climate crisis, traffic gridlock, and failure to implement a circular waste economy by more burning of waste? That question, I believe, is from Liz McCormack from Borough of Bexley. Mr. Mayor, we got three questions. We got very limited time left. So can you please go ahead within 2 minutes to answer all three or any of the three questions, please?
Well, can I thank all three questions, raising three really important issues. So last year I met with Extinction Rebellion to discuss the issue of a citizens' assembly. And I know some boroughs across London are piloting this. I think Camden may be one of them. And we're interested to learn any lessons from the citizens' assembly. I'm not in favour of abolishing the mayor, though, and to replace the mayor with a citizens' assembly. But I'm waiting to see what the outcomes are of the various boroughs that are looking into the role of citizens' assembly. Over the last 4.5 years, Londoners will know, and tonight's a good illustration of this, we've got more Londoners becoming active citizens by, for example, Talk London and other things we have to get Londoners engaged with the running of our city. We'll continue to make progress in that area as well. In relation to what green measures we'd like to carry on, I think this is a quite profound question, because I think although this pandemic has been absolutely awful, the worst health, economic, social crisis our city has faced since the Second World War, this is an opportunity that can't afford to be missed. One of the things that we've done in London is we have started working across London, outside our silos, with other parts of what I call Team London. And so I've set up a London Recovery Board that I chair with the chair of London Councils, Councillor Georgia Gould. And we have 9 missions as far as our recovery is concerned. And some of those come out of some of the measures we've brought in during this pandemic. A Green New Deal, making sure we make progress on some of the things that we've talked about over the course of the last hour and a half to make them permanent going forward, how we make sure our high streets are vibrant, how we make sure we support young people during a difficult time. And I'm hoping that these 9 missions, which, by the way, have got buy-in from City Hall, from councils, from the public sector, from the private sector, from faith communities, from community groups, from voluntary groups, will be things that are permanent going forward from this awful pandemic. As I said, this is an opportunity we can't afford to miss, a really important question. In relation to incinerator, I've been quite clear, we do not need any more incinerator capacity in our city. Councillor Cooper, Senator Cooper referred earlier on to the need for us to recycle more. And we're doing some really good work with the London Waste and Recycling Board in this area. And so I'm happy the government has given permission for another incinerator. I'm not sure it's required. What I do know is definitely we don't need any more incinerators. What we need to be doing is reducing, reusing and recycling.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm afraid we are out of time on air quality and the environment part of our discussion tonight. Can we move on, please? Okay, so we will now move on to topic number 4, which is on housing. Please make sure that you do log on to chat line if you want to raise any issues on housing related matters. Can I welcome for the first question, Lindsay Brady from Barnet will ask that first question to the members and the mayor. Lindsay.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. Why is the mayor selling off TfL land to build housing under the recommended amount of affordable housing and lack of infrastructure to support these builds, like doctors' surgeries, schools or adequate parking, which don't support current residents?
Mr. Mayor.
Lindsay, which scheme do you mean?
I live in High Barnet, and I understand that you're selling the TfL land. There's a campaign at the moment, Hands Off High Barnet. There's also a few other schemes like Cockfosters, Enfield, where you're building high-rise buildings.
Okay, thanks, Lindsay. So we, according to independent experts, need to be providing between 55 and 60,000 new homes a year in our city to meet our population. But unlike the previous mayor, we don't want them to be luxury penthouses that only the privileged few can afford. They need to be genuinely affordable homes that Londoners can afford. So I've thrown in the bin, Lindsay, the previous mayor's definition of what an affordable home is. His definition was a home that's 80% of market value to rent, or a home costing £450,000 to buy. And what I've said is an affordable home must be one of 3 things: either a council home, a home where you pay a London living rent, a third of average earnings. So the London living rent in Barnet is different to the London living rent in Camden. Or third, a home where you part buy and part rent with a deposit of about £5,000. But I've also said to TfL, because we own surplus land, what you can't do is what the previous mayor did, sell it to the highest bidder. The land's bought by foreigners. I've got nothing against foreigners, so my best friends and family are foreigners, but they build homes that are sold off-plan for investors overseas. We've got to make sure that we have those homes for Londoners. So we're keeping the land and we're having joint partnerships with developers to try and maximise the amount of homes we can build, but making sure there is the social infrastructure in place, GPs, schools, community centres. On some of our developments, we've even got theatres and pubs as part of the scheme as well. Some councils, understandably, aren't in favour of additional housing. Barnet actually is a good example of a bad council that fails to provide housing for local residents. And that's a good example of where I'm afraid I've got to step in and say, you know what, you've got to provide genuinely affordable homes for your residents. And that's one of my responsibilities. And here's the good news. In the year before I became mayor, only 13% of homes granted permission by the previous mayor, 1-3, were affordable. Last year, it went up to 37%. But also last year, we broke the record for the largest number of genuinely affordable homes started in our city, and the largest number of council homes began since 1983. I was literally a boy wearing short trousers then.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Very briefly, Assembly Member Devenish, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I love the comment about short trousers. Going back to public consultation in terms of the schemes that the Barnet resident quite rightly talked about, do you think you've done enough in terms of listening to Londoners before you build these tower blocks? And I'd also refer you to the South Kent Tube Station TfL development. There's been little listening and lots of trying to ram things through.
Thank you for that. Can I thank Lindsay for raising the question? And we now move on to second question. And can I welcome Priscilla Seminario? I hope I got the family name right, from Islington. Please, Priscilla, go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair, and good evening. My question is about renting. It's a well-known fact that affordable housing is a key issue in London. Many young professional families, mine included, are renting privately and pay almost 50% of our monthly take-home income in rent. The pandemic laid bare a scary reality, being just a paycheck away from not affording rent. For those of us who don't have the possibility to save for a deposit, affordable housing is still out of reach when most of our income disappears monthly in rent payments. My question is about renters and their rights. What does the Mayor of London propose to do about improving renters' rights? Are there plans to introduce rent control and adopt a more continental European rental model to allow families and renters to live and take part in communities long term?
Mr. Mayor.
Thanks, Priscilla, for this really important question. So I explained in my opening speech that my family benefited from a council home. My dad was a bus driver. My mum used to do piecework as a seamstress, and they couldn't have afforded to buy their own home. Because they had a council home, my mum and dad could put money aside for a deposit to buy their own home. Unfortunately, over the last 20, 30 years, councils under the Right to Buy scheme have been selling off these municipal housing, the council homes, but they've not been replacing them or replenishing them. So for every 5 council homes sold off, only 1 has been built, which is why we've got the crisis, Priscilla, that you're experiencing in London. Too many Londoners are renting privately and can't afford to put aside money, as you say, to save a deposit for your own home. So we're doing a number of things from City Hall in the absence of real power from the government. I'll give you some examples. We have launched the country's first database. It's open to the public, where you can see any rogue landlords, so you know which landlord to avoid. And it's a really important tool we've set up. The second thing is we lobbied the government, and we were successful, to remove the fee people pay when they sign a new tenancy agreement. And that's saving people like you an average £600 when you move from tenancy. We also managed to persuade the government to get rid of no-fault evictions, because one of the big concerns people like you have, Priscilla, who rent privately, is at any day your landlord can say you've got to go, even though it's no fault of your own. They've not actually brought that in yet. We're trying to persuade them to bring that in, even though they've agreed to do so. Well, we have been successful in persuading the government to make it unlawful to evict during this pandemic. We want them to extend that for a longer period of time. But you're spot on. We need in London to have powers to bring in rent controls, and that's what I'm lobbying the government to do. And I'm also lobbying the government to freeze rents in the private sector for at least 2 years to stop rents going up, which makes it very difficult for people like you to afford to pay their rent, particularly when many people have lost their main source of income during this pandemic, or are taking a pay drop because they're on a zero-hours contract and work in the gig economy. And it's really important the government realises we've got a housing crisis in London. We're not going to build the homes we need overnight. So in the meantime, they've got to help people like you and thousands like you who rent in the private sector.
Thank you. Can I invite Assembly Member Andrew Boff to respond, please? Thank you.
The problem with affordability in London is because there aren't enough homes being built. Prior to the 2016 election, the mayor promised that he would ensure the delivery of 80,000 homes a year, which should have meant 320,000 homes by now. Despite a record grant from government, he's only built 16,000. But it's even worse. There are 360,000 young people being brought up in overcrowded conditions. This has been made worse for them by the lockdown. And Londoners need to know that there will be bigger, better, and more homes being built that are suitable for families. He's removed the family-sized homes target from his plans, and the few homes he has built have been more of the same, condemning families to live in tower blocks with little play space and with all the associated dangers and costs of that kind of building. You know, like Donald Trump, he's refused to listen to his own advisors who are calling for him to wake up to the facts, and he stubbornly refused to review his housing policies to help those families. The mayor is fond of saying that solving housing problems is a marathon rather than a sprint. No, it's not. For those families in need, for those people who can't afford accommodation, it's a sprint, and I wish he'd get his running shoes on.
Thank you, Assemblymember Boff. Can I thank Priscilla for raising the question, and we now go on to the third question, which will come from Kimberly Smith, who's from London Borough of Westminster. Kimberly, good evening. Please go ahead with your question.
Hi, I'm Kim Smith. My question is related to housing. A new government legislation, EWS1 certification process, requires all blocks of flats over 5 stories to have external wall cladding and balcony material checked for combustible material and relevant fireproofing. Any block built prior to 2007, if no cladding is present, requires the insulation behind to be checked also. These investigative works can only be carried out by a limited number of specialists. Therefore, the waitlist is extensive. Investigation and remedial costs are expensive, which will fall on the lessee, private landlord, social housing provider. These could be thousands, possibly millions. Without this certificate, financial institutions are refusing to finance purchases of flats. Hence, this will have a serious impact on the housing market, making it virtually impossible to move or buy a flat. How can the London Assembly help with simplifying the process, reducing the significant costs and resolving the present situation of not being able to sell or buy?
Mr. Mayor.
Kim, can I just say I've spoken to many leaseholders like you who have been affected so badly by the awful cladding fiasco that has been exposed by the Grenfell Tower fire. I'm a big supporter of the End Our Cladding Scandal campaign. And there's a big issue you raised in relation to the EWS1 form. And so you're right, there are big issues here. One is the cost of getting the certificate. 2, we've discovered there are some dodgy people giving out these certificates and they are fake. LBC currently exposed this, and I've reported that particular person to the Met Police Service and Trading Standards. What's happened now is the experts who do these forms are scared because their professional indemnity insurance isn't covering them. What we now have is across the country more than 600,000 people, Kim, like you, who are stuck in homes they can't sell because you can't get the EWS1 form. So these aren't powers that I have. So I wrote to the Secretary of State for MHCLG. He's a man called Robert Jenrick on the 21st of September. Actually, my letter could have been written by you, Kim, because many of the things you've said were in my letter. It's been now almost 2 months, and he hasn't had the courtesy to respond to the letter. Because of the external system, you can't guarantee the safety of potential purchaser. And so the question of it's a particular issue in London because we know 2/3 of taller buildings across the country are in our city, often the building owner.
Can
So what I'll do, Kim, is I will ask my team to chase up this government minister tomorrow in relation to a response, because there are thousands of people like you across our city and across our country who need support from the government. One of them the government can do is provide additional funding to unlock this situation. Another thing they can do very easily is to resolve the issue of professional indemnity insurance and to make it easier to get the EWS1 form for people like you.
Can I apologize, Kimberly? We had a problem with broadcasting, so none of us got to hear most of the response from Mr. Mayor. We will make sure, Kimberly, that you get the response that came from Mr. Mayor as soon as we can. Can I also remind everyone, assembly members, to make sure that when you're not speaking, please put your microphones on mute, because that is creating broadcasting interference and problems. So please make sure that your microphones are on silent mode unless and until you come to speak. So I'd like to invite Assembly Member Andrew Dismore to reply on this issue on EWS form, please.
Thank you, Chair. The Fire Committee, which I chair, actually held a whole session on this the other week, and the transcript sets out a lot of the information about EWS1. There are two things in particular the government need to do. The first is to deal with the problem of the shortage of fire safety engineers. It takes a long time to train them. There are only 300 in the country as a whole. And of those 300, many can't get the professional indemnity insurance they needed. So what the government should do is act as the insurer of last resort to underwrite their work so we get the full 300 working. The second thing they should do is try and reduce the demand for EWS forms, which they created. Originally, they were only meant for buildings over 18 metres, but in January, they started to consult on buildings over 11 metres. And the net result of that is that the banks and mortgage companies immediately started to asking for EWS1 forms for over 11 metre high buildings, when in fact that wasn't even meant to be covered, it was only a consultation. So the government need to talk to the lenders and make it clear that they should not be asking for EWS1 forms on lower buildings. But the problem is the government have just been sleepwalking on the whole issue of cladding. At the moment, we know, according to the London Fire Brigade, that in London, there are 72,000 buildings potentially with fire risk in them of one sort or another. The London big housing associations say it'll cost £4 billion just to deal with their buildings requiring cladding shifting, and the government have only come up with £1.6 billion nationally. It's a big problem. The government do need to come up with more money, and the easiest thing they could do also is act as insurer of last resort. They did that for people affected by flooding, so they should for also people affected by bad cladding.
Thank you. Because of time constraint, I'm only going to take one question from the online, and that is from Sam Pomfret from Lewisham. And the question is, in these times of increased poverty, what is the mayor doing to decrease homelessness in London, especially for the young who are looking to get into the housing market for the first time? Mr. Mayor, very, very briefly, please, your answer.
Well, the most important thing we've got to do is to build more genuinely affordable homes. And I want to just correct a misapprehension that may have been given by a comment made by a previous Assembly member. It is a fact, over the last 3 years, we have built more genuinely affordable homes than ever since the mayor had these powers. Last year, we began more than 17,500. The year before, more than 14,500. The year before, more than 12,500. Last year, we broke a record for the most council homes. So we've got to build more genuinely affordable homes, but also we've got to end the blight of rough sleeping. I'm really worried about the amount of Londoners who are sleeping rough. We've managed to persuade the government to have everybody in approach when it comes to rough sleeping. We managed to get 4,000 rough sleepers off our streets during the first part of the lockdown. We've got to make sure as we enter winter and more young people are losing their jobs, they're not ending up on our streets. We've got to stop them becoming homeless, rough sleepers in the first place. And we've got to make sure if they do, heaven forbid, we get them off the streets. If they stay on the streets, they're risking their own life and well-being, but also there are issues in relation to making mental health worse or becoming mentally unwell when you're on the streets. That's why it's really important that we sort out the issues in relation to welfare benefits changes, make sure young people have jobs to go into and have genuinely affordable homes they can move into. Really important. One of the biggest issues we face is to build the genuinely affordable homes that we need.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We are now out of time on housing. So let's very swiftly move on to our next topic, which is growing London's economy. And can I welcome for the first question, Isabella DBS from Sadiq, who will ask a question. Can I ask Isabella to proceed with a question, please?
I'm a freelance lifestyle engineer. I work in London venues. I'm also a co-chair of Bectus London Union of Venue Technicians. London has always been considered the mecca of live events and culture, and thanks to the very skilled live events workers, this city and UK in general has benefited from an £84 million worth industry for years. But now 600,000 and counting jobs are at risks because of COVID. Since the first lockdown, live events workers have not been able to work because majority of London venues are closed. Some venues are shut for good, or social distancing doesn't allow venues to reopen at full capacity without major financial loss. Some of us managed to get some financial help. Some of us didn't get any help at all. And some of us, like me, retrained and started a temporary job in a supermarket, but there aren't enough jobs for everybody. The risk is that when and if live events come back, there won't be any or enough skilled live events workers left, because a lot of us are forced to leave the industry right now. Mayor, as a worker and as a representative of workers, but also as a culture music lover, I'm worried about the future. And I'm asking you to help us to come up with a plan to save the live events industry in London. Thank you.
Please, Mr. Mayor, your response.
Well, Isabella, firstly, thank you for the role you play in making London the greatest city in the world. One of the reasons why we are is because of our culture. As you said, you contribute billions of pounds towards our economy in good times, but also 1 out of 6 jobs in our city are in the cultural and creative sector. The Deputy Mayor for Culture, Justine Simons, but also the Knights Czar, Amy LeMay, have been working incredibly hard before the pandemic and during the pandemic to help this area. I'll give you some examples of the work we've been doing. Because of our work, we've kept 500 live music venues and venues that do live entertainment open. We have a culture at risk office that's been doing that. We've been criticised, by the way, by some in this assembly for investing in culture, but you've articulated why it's so important for us to do so. We set aside £2.3 million to help at the culture at risk office in helping the industry that you're talking about. But also, Londoners have been so incredibly generous in relation to the Pay It Forward scheme, £1.5 million helping those get advanced cash flow that helps provide wages to people like you who are freelancers and have no other income stream. We're also lobbying, Isabella, the government, because there are 3 million people across the country, 3 million across the country, many of them freelancers who've been excluded from any assistance from the government. Even the extension of the furlough scheme until March, which we were calling for, still means freelancers are not getting the help they deserve because they're either self-employed and partly working, because they've only recently become self-employed, or because they get paid through dividends in a company or earn about £50,000. And the risk is this, Isabella. When it comes to us coming out of the lockdown, you're absolutely right. Because you'll have had to get other jobs to make ends meet, to pay for your bills, you won't return to culture, the creative industries, hospitality, and our unique selling point, our USP as the greatest city in the world will be lost. And so future investors, rather than coming to London, will choose other cities around Europe and other cities around the world because we won't have the cultural offer. And so we're going to continue to lobby the government to do much more to help this area, to persuade the Treasury to do much more to help freelancers like you in this sector, but also to persuade the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sports to do much more to help those who have fallen through the cracks. I welcome the contribution to institutions on people, and that's why it's very important we continue to lobby them to help people.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for your full response. And can I thank Isabella for raising the issue? I will now move on to the next question and welcome Alejandro Salvador from Barnet. Can you please go ahead, Alejandro, with your question, please? Thank you.
Good evening. Currently, many young adults and teenagers are underemployed and unemployed in London due to the effects of the pandemic. Many are wasting their time applying for jobs, resulting in businesses responding with, unfortunately, some between the ages of 16 and 18 are frustrated with the coincidence of COVID-19 becoming an issue in such a crucial stage in their lives. What short-term measures are being taken place to reduce those entering into adulthood from struggling financially, especially those whose guardians rely on means-tested benefits?
Mr. Mayor.
Alejandro, thank you very much for your question. It's a really important issue. I'll give you some examples of some of the good news, but before I do, let me just explain why I do worry about your generation. I lived through the 1980s, and during the 1980s, we had mass unemployment of young people. And unfortunately, many of my peer group were written off, which sounds a horrible thing to say about young people. And so I'm doing my bit to avoid a repeat of the 1980s. And that's why you'll have heard during my opening speech me saying my mantra in City Hall is jobs, jobs, jobs. And that's why, by the way, I fought the government who wanted to take away free travel for under 18-year-olds. Alejandro, you mentioned 16 to 18-year-olds. If the government got their way, and by the way, some people on this call on the Assembly, that free travel would have been taken away from under 18s, which you need and is a lifeline. Often you choose a further education college because you get free travel. So as long as I'm mayor, we've got that free travel for under 18s, which is really important. I've also made sure, and I spoke recently to the adult education leaders, so these are FE colleges across London, and I've said to them, be more flexible in the budgets that I give you. And the good news is they've agreed. So they're going to set aside free courses for young people who are unemployed, as you've said, or underemployed, or receiving the minimum wage, to try and give you the skills, to give you the jobs that may be available coming forward that you currently haven't got the skills for, to make you match fit. We've also making sure we're working with careers experts to link up young people with the jobs that are coming along, because there may be jobs over here, you're available here, and it just takes a bit of linking up to give you the jobs and the opportunities that you need. And we're also, at the same time, making sure that we have young Londoners getting the skills for the jobs being created. There are three areas, Alejandro, that are potentially quite exciting. One is tech. We've set aside millions of pounds for a tech talent pipeline, giving you the skills to get the tech jobs being created. Two, we've set up the Mayor's Construction Academy. Again, these are future-proof jobs. We're giving people the skills they need. And the third area is what's called WIN, and it's the Workforce Integration Network. One of my big concerns is what I saw in the 1980s with my peer group. These are young black men who are not getting the opportunities that the rest of us can get. And so the WIN scheme is targeted towards young black men in particular to make sure they get the support they need to have their potential fulfilled.
Thank you.
You go to the City Hall website, you can find out more details about this, or again, Navin, with your permission, give the City Hall team your details, and I'll make sure we'll provide you with all the links and details you need, and we'll make sure I use my Twitter account and my Facebook and Instagram to amplify some of these things we're offering young Londoners that it's really important they have, which is a helping hand to have their potential fulfilled.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Can we have a response from Assembly Member Susan Hall, please? Thank you.
Hello, and thank you, Alejandro. This is a real problem for youngsters, as it is for everybody else. And the Mayor started this meeting by saying that his focus was on jobs, jobs. Tony.
Sorry, we can't hear you.
I'm not on mute. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Please go ahead.
Oh, okay. Right. I was saying that if you actually concentrate, Mr. Mayor, on supporting companies, big and small, to help to protect jobs, you preserve livelihoods and you keep the economy going. And COVID is an economic crisis, as we all know, as much as it is a health crisis. And this will not help people like Ilandro. So how actually is the mayor responding to this situation? Well, in June, his deputy mayor for business told us that the mayor would be producing an economic recovery strategy, a plan to help businesses navigate these rocky times. It was on the top of their minds, apparently. But here we are in November, and we still haven't had that. The deputy mayor boasted last week that the mayoralty was helping support businesses. But we found out actually that it's only 0.3% of businesses they're helping. Businesses are the ones that will actually provide the jobs. And it's jobs that young people need, as the young gentleman that came in today. And quite honestly, Mr. Mayor, if you don't concentrate on looking after the businesses, the jobs will not follow.
Thank you, Assembly Member. And can I thank Eliandro for the question? We must move on to question number 3, which will come from Mark Benin from Camden. Can you go ahead, Mark, with your question, please?
Hi, my name's Mark Bannon and I live in the borough of Camden. Dear Chair, when London retail and hospitality is on the brink of collapse, you should be doing everything in your power to get people coming into London. Yet you've done the opposite, putting more hurdles to prevent entry. This has been done by 1, increasing congestion charge times and cost, 2, by limiting or closing tube station hours of operation, and thirdly, by reducing road capacity by increasing cycle lanes. People don't want to cycle in the cold and the rain if they're going on a night out, and they don't want to do shopping on a bicycle. I believe these 3 steps alone have reduced people's interest and motivation in coming into London. Right now, this is not about people finding alternatives to driving. That's not the priority. The priority is saving our city from becoming a ghost town. It's about opening up the arteries of London during these tough times so that everyone can get in by whichever means they choose. After the recovery, it can be different. So my question is, while addressing the 3 points I've mentioned, I'd like you to explain how these measures you've adopted improve retail and hospitality.
Mr. Mayor?
Mark, thank you for your question. And again, I really hate correcting Londoners unless they're wrong. I'm afraid I've got to address some of the issues you raised. Firstly, look, it's a false choice or a false dichotomy to choose between health and the economy. They're intrinsically linked. And one of the reasons why this government's got it so wrong compared to the countries around the world from South Korea, Thailand, Taiwan, Japan, is because of them thinking it's a choice between the economy and health and not getting a grip with a test, trace, isolate system. We are in a lockdown now, the second lockdown. That wasn't inevitable. And that's led to not simply adverse health consequences. More than 50,000 people across our country have lost their lives, which means at least 50,000 bereaved families across our country. 9,000 of them are in our city. And had we got a grip with the health crisis back in March and April, we wouldn't now be in this economic crisis come November, which required the government to do another U-turn on the furlough scheme, was going to extend in October, then in November, then in March, which has led to the biggest jump in youth unemployment in any quarter since 1992. And the second thing is we won't have the U-turn from the government in relation to the lockdown. Back in October, I was lobbying the government, using the advice the government receives, to have a very short 2-week national circuit breaker. A 2-week circuit breaker would have avoided the lockdown we're in now, and which would have helped businesses in the retail sector and the hospitality sector, which you really care about. But we are because of the government's incompetence. How do we get out of this? Well, firstly, we've got to make sure we follow the rules so that we get the R number, the reproduction number below 1, which is the route map towards a recovery. Unless the reproduction number is below 1, we simply won't be able to lift the restrictions. The other thing is we need to have a plan for the central activity zone. I wrote to the government months ago after consulting those in retail and those in hospitality about a way to support them. One of the ideas we had was to extend the furlough scheme. The government said no. They then did a U-turn. Another idea we had was to extend the business rates holiday from March when it ends, including next year, which is really important because businesses are deciding now for their plans for next year. The third idea we had was for targeted financial support for those sectors that rely upon a footfall for their business: retail, hospitality, leisure, tourism, culture. And the other thing I lobbied the government for was not to impose draconian, vindictive conditions on Londoners. Increasing the congestion charge to £15 was a condition imposed by this government. Mark, they weren't just happy with that condition, they wanted to extend it up to the North Circular and the South Circular, but I fought them off. And it's really important for us to continue to say to the government, don't punish Londoners for doing the right thing, but also get a grip with the test, trace, isolate support system and support our businesses. It's far cheaper to support businesses to stop them going bust and to keep people on furlough, to stop them being made redundant, than supporting these businesses and these individuals when their businesses go bust and they're made unemployed. That's why I said at the beginning, the mantra from this administration is jobs, jobs, jobs. And rather than the government fighting us, treating us as adversaries or with suspicion, they should work with us.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have difficulty with this. Okay, one last question very, very quickly from Chet, and that's jobs, jobs, jobs is your mantra. What are you doing to create new high-skilled jobs rather than low-paid, insecure jobs? Where is the investment in the green economy? And that is question from Alex Chung from Richmond upon Thames. Mr. Mayor, very briefly, please.
That's a cracking question, thank you. So as I explained, one of the things that I've set up is the London Recovery Board, which I co-chair with the chair of the London councils. They're the 32, 33 councils in our city. And we're pooling our expertise and our resources with the private sector to have a Green New Deal, to use the opportunity provided by this awful pandemic to create jobs that are future-proof, that are viable. We have the largest number of electric buses of any city in Europe. We want to increase that. That will create jobs across the country that are green, viable jobs. We now have more than 5,000 charging points in our city, 1 for every 6 electric cars. We're going to continue to increase that, which will create more jobs. We're going to retrofit our buildings, which will help create jobs, help deal with the climate emergency so we can reach zero carbon by 2030. London is ahead of the country in relation to saying all our new homes should be zero carbon, but all new non-residential should be zero carbon as well, again, creating jobs in this green sector as well. I've explained our commitment to a construction academy. Modular homes is one where we can make sure we create new jobs. That's why it's really important we're investing in this area as well. But the real opportunity comes in relation to the election that took place across the pond, because we will now have a president of the USA that doesn't deny climate change or doesn't want to delay taking action. He's agreed to sign up to the Paris Climate Change Agreement. That means next year when COP26 takes place in Glasgow, it can be a springboard for our government to finally wake up to the challenges posed by climate change and use that risk as an opportunity to create future-proof jobs, particularly if we've left the European Union without a deal. It'll be really important we find jobs that are future-proof, well-paid, highly trained, that are fit for purpose in the 21st century.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And can I thank Mark, can I thank for the last question. We now move on to the last segment of our questions. And that is on any topic that you want to identify. We don't have much time left, so please register your likes very quickly. Your questions could cover health, culture, sports, volunteering, Brexit, for example. The floor is yours. Can I have questions, please? Okay, we have, we start with the question which is from Youth Assembly Chair Sumaya Bangura on young Londoners and COVID-19 recovery. Sumaya asks, how do the Mayor and London Assembly plan to address issues affecting young Londoners as a result of pandemic, specifically in relation to difficulties of finding future employment, safe education, and mental health and well-being, and how will the Mayor and London Assembly work with young Londoners to address these issues and develop a youth-led strategy? Mr. Mayor, question from Sumaya, Youth Assembly Chair. Over to you.
So, Mayor, thank you very much for your question. In relation to mental health, one of the big concerns that I've had for some time is the mental ill health that Londoners are suffering during this pandemic. So the two things that we've done that directly helps young people like you is Thrive London, if you get a chance just to Google that, but also the Good Thinking app to help young Londoners as well. But I want to reassure you that the work the London Recovery Board is doing has at its core young people. And so I mentioned the 9 missions we have. One of them is a new deal for young people, and that's to ensure young people get a personal mentor, but also good quality youth activities and facilities around them. Another issue that helps address the issue you're talking about is one of the missions, one of the 9, is mental health and well-being. And it's really important we get rid of the stigma attached to mental ill health. You know, when I talked about my mental ill health that I was suffering because of the pandemic, a member of the Assembly questioned me about it at Mayor's question time, suggesting that I should have given up being the Mayor because of my mental ill health. That shows there's still a stigma attached to mental ill health. The other issue that we really think will help young people is having digital access for all. One of the things we've noticed, particularly since the lockdown in March, is the number of young Londoners who couldn't go to school or college or university who didn't have access to a laptop or good quality broadband to connect with their teacher or their lecturer. So that's some examples, Sumaya, of our priority for young people. If you get a chance, just Google the 9 missions that Team London has agreed on the London Recovery Board, and let us know if you think we need to be doing more to address the issues. I'm really worried about young Londoners because you've been at the brunt of some of the consequences of the COVID pandemic, not least the inability of the government to be generous and humane and give free school meals to young Londoners. And so it's really important that we don't continue to ignore and neglect you, as I'm afraid this government's been seeking to do over the last 8 months.
Thank you. May I invite Assembly Member Jeanette Arnold for a very, very brief response, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I would just like to commend the Mayor and the Deputy Mayor, Joanne McCartney, for the amazing work that they've been doing. And at the heart of that work has been about looking to mitigate against the impact of COVID on our young people. I have spent most of my time really chasing and beating up the Secretary of State in terms of the inappropriate use of the algorithm, their disregard for young people. And I just say that if I say to all Londoners, young Londoners, and I don't praise him willy-nilly, let me be clear, that in Sadiq Khan, you have a mayor who's absolutely committed to the well-being, especially the mental health well-being of our young people. And as chair of the educational panel, I will stay on his case to make sure that every promise he makes, he delivers. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm afraid we do have a couple of more questions, but due to the very strict time constraints, I'm not able to take them, but be sure that there will be a response to your questions. So that is all the time we have tonight. I'm sorry that we didn't get to all of your questions that we wanted to. May I thank everyone for attending and participating in our first ever People's Question Time online. It has been an experience, but I hope that we have done justice as best as we could do this evening to your questions. For anyone who wants to get more involved next time, don't forget to keep an eye on our website for details of how to do this for our next People's Question Time, which will be early in the next year. You can also keep up to date with the work of the London Assembly on any of our social media accounts. We'd love to hear from you, though, of course, our first ever People's Question Time online. Pre-registered audience members will be emailed the link for a feedback survey, bear with me, which will also explain how to submit questions that we did not have time to answer tonight. As I said, there will be response coming through if you did have a question for tonight. May I wish everyone good night and thank you once again for joining us at our first ever People's Question Time online. Thank you very much. Good night. And normally I would say safe journey, but it's more for me than I guess you who are sitting at home comfortably. Good night and lovely to have this event. Bye-bye.